The sun wasn't high in the sky anymore, but it was still hot enough to sting my skin. I squinted, a habit of a man who spends too much time staring at an unending horizon. The sky was wide, a pale, washed-out blue without a single cloud to promise relief. Everything below it looked scoured bare, like God had taken a rough brush to the earth. Wind-bitten rocks scattered scrub and dirt that cracked open like dried clay. My mule, a stubborn, sure-footed creature named Silas, plodded along a narrow cut in the terrain. My eyes scanned the telegraph poles to the west, a straight line of forgotten hope stretching into nothing. The wire above sagged slightly between posts, a telltale sign of a fix needing to be made. Another thing added to the list. I swear the list of necessary evils out here was longer than the wire itself. I pulled Silas to a stop and took a long drink from my canteen. The water was lukewarm and tasted of metal, but it was salvation all the same. Sand scratched against my boots as I stepped down, walking the ridge to get a better view, watching for any sign of breaks in the line. My job wasn't glorious. Telegraph maintenance rarely was. It was a trade of solitude, a constant negotiation with a land that didn't want to be crossed. I rode alone across long stretches of nowhere, splicing wire, hammering pins, replacing poles after storms. I was a ghost in the machine, trying to keep the line humming between dead towns where no one lived anymore. I hadn't seen another person in days. The silence wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was a roaring emptiness that seemed to press in on you from all sides. But when I looked out over the slope beyond the ridge, I saw something that stopped me cold. My heart hammered a sudden rhythm against my ribs, a sound so loud in the silence I was sure Silas could hear it. About 80 yards out, near a patch of brutal-looking yucca, a figure was staked to the ground. Arms behind a post, knees buckled, head down, not moving. My first thought was a grim one. A warning. I had seen them before. Not here, not like this, but I'd seen the cruelty that men were capable of. I stared for a long, hard moment, then checked the horizon out of habit. Right, then left. No other riders, no wagons, no sign of anyone around. Just me, Silas, and the terrible heat. My hand went to the rifle slung across my back, unhooked it without rush. My movements were slow practice, the motions of a man who knows that haste out here can get you killed faster than a rattlesnake. I whistled low to Silas, a quiet signal, and began walking. The wind carried the scent of sunburned grass and then something else. Faint but bitter, it smelled of blood and old sweat and something deeply wrong. Flies buzzed low to the ground, a thick living halo around the figure. As I got closer, the grim reality became clear. It was a woman, an Apache woman. Her skin had darkened from days of exposure, but not evenly. Her cheeks and shoulders were burned raw where her deerskin dress had fallen open. One side of the dress was torn from shoulder to waist, exposing part of her chest. A leather cord still held what was left of the beads and fringe, though they were crusted with dust and what looked like dried blood. One foot was bare, the other wore a moccasin cracked at the sole. Her ankles were swollen dark with bruises. Her legs trembled slightly, a fragile, involuntary dance of a body on the edge of surrender. I slowed my rifle low but ready. She wasn't dead, but she was close. She didn't look up when I approached. Her face was tilted downward, eyes barely open, jaw slack. Her lips were dry and split, cracked with thirst. Blood had dried along her inner thigh, and her breathing was ragged, shallow, and irregular. I could hear it now, a faint rasping sound against the wind. I knelt in front of her, resting on one knee the way I'd learned to do years ago in the war, not to show weakness but to get a better view. Sweat ran down my temple and stung my eye. The sun pressed in on both of us, a heavy, suffocating blanket. Her eyes twitched. She tried to focus on me, her gaze a blurry, unfocused thing. I studied her face. I couldn't tell if the streaks down her cheeks were from tears or just sweat and dirt. Her lips moved, a silent, desperate prayer she couldn't utter. She wasn't going to last much longer. An hour, maybe two, and the buzzards would have their way. I slid the knife from my belt, the blade dull with use but sharp enough for this. I leaned in slowly, showing the steel in the light so she wouldn't panic. She didn't flinch. She just blinked, a slow, labored movement. All right, I muttered, more to myself than her. Easy now. The rope was tied tight behind the post, an unforgiving knot that had been made with purpose. I slid behind it, working the blade carefully until the thick cord snapped. She pitched forward as soon as they gave. I caught her with both arms, one under her shoulders, the other behind her knees. She weighed less than I expected, a startling, fragile burden. As I lifted her, her head rested weakly against my chest. Her body gave off a heat, a feverish, unnatural warmth that radiated through my shirt. She was barely conscious. Her fingers curled weakly against my coat, a ghost of a grip, but she didn't speak. She couldn't. I didn't waste time. I carried her back up the hill, the mule stamping nervously as I approached. "You're all right," I said under my breath, more reassurance than statement. I draped her across Silas's back with care, tying a strap loosely to keep her from falling. Then I climbed up behind her, steadying her body with one arm as I turned the animal toward the South Canyon. My cabin sat about 4 miles from here, a rotted-out old place left behind by a miner 10 winters ago. I had repaired enough to get by. A roof that didn't leak much, a cot, a stove, a small stream nearby. It was a lonely existence, but it was mine. I had planned to check 3 more miles of line before sundown. Now that didn't matter. Her weight leaned heavy against my arm as we rode. Every few minutes I checked her, breathing shallow but still there. I didn't know who she was. I didn't know what she'd done to be left out like that. But no one deserved that kind of death. No one. The thought of her had seared itself into my mind. I couldn't forget the image of her staked there, a human sacrifice to the desert. The sun dipped low behind the canyon wall by the time we reached the edge of the ravine where my cabin sat. The air was cooler down there, a blessed relief. The wind quieted by the rock walls that curled around the valley floor like a cupped hand. A narrow stream ran nearby, clear, cold, and reliable even in drought. That was why I'd chosen this place. It was my only luxury. I rode Silas slow down the incline, one hand on the reins, the other wrapped firmly around the woman's waist to keep her from slipping. She hadn't stirred once during the ride. Her breathing was shallow but steady, a small fragile proof of life. Her head leaned against my shoulder, her body too limp to resist the sway of the mule's gait. By the time we reached the cabin, the light was going fast. I dismounted and caught her again as she began to slide. My arms wrapped beneath her legs and back, lifting her like a child. Her head lolled back, exposing the angry red blisters on her neck and collarbone. One of the beads on her torn dress had snapped loose, dangling by a single thread. The cabin door creaked as I nudged it open with my boot. Inside, it smelled of leather, tobacco, and old wood smoke. It wasn't much, just a single room with a cot against the back wall, a stove in the corner, and a table with 2 chairs, though only one had been used in a long time. A few tools and wire coils rested on a shelf. The place was clean, plain, and quiet. It was my sanctuary from a world I didn't want to be a part of anymore. I laid her carefully on the cot, adjusting the pillow beneath her head. Her arms stayed curled inward, her hands still bound by a tension I couldn't untie. I pulled the blanket over her, hesitating as I noticed the way her dress had torn fully across one breast. The sight of her vulnerability sent a jolt of something I couldn't name through me. I looked away, my face hot, and gently covered her up. Her breathing hitched a small, scared sound. I stepped back. "You hear me?" I asked, my voice low. She didn't answer. I crouched by the stove, stoked the embers to life, and set water to boil. The fire caught and the cabin felt a little less cold. Then I poured a measure of clean drinking water into a tin cup and walked it back to the bed. She didn't respond when I pressed the cup to her lips, but when I tilted it slightly, she swallowed. A few slow gulps, then a weak cough, dry and small. The sound was like a prayer, a small victory. I sat beside the cot for a long while, the cup in my hands, 100 questions swirling in my head. Who had done this to her? Why? What had she done, if anything, to deserve such a fate? But none of them seemed worth asking. They didn't matter. What mattered was that she was here now, a fragile flicker of life in my quiet world. By nightfall, she was burning with fever. Her skin felt like a hot stone beneath my fingers. I soaked a cloth in cool water and pressed it to her forehead, her neck, her arms. Her skin twitched beneath my touch, but she didn't wake. The cabin stayed quiet except for the stove ticking and the mule shuffling outside. Around midnight, she started to mutter in her own tongue, whispers and fragments. The words were hoarse, broken, carried by heat and fear. I didn't understand any of it, but I stayed close, sponge in hand, pressing coolness where I could. I didn't sleep, just sat beside her every so often, refolding the cloth and replacing it, watching, waiting. The ghosts of my own past seemed to rise up in the darkness with her. I knew what it was to be alone with sickness, and to watch someone you loved slip away. I couldn't let it happen again. The next morning, just before dawn, she opened her eyes. They were wide black eyes, dry, clouded by confusion. She flinched hard when she saw me, instinct pulling her body backward, but her muscles failed her. She whimpered, curling into herself, one arm dragging the blanket higher up her chest. "Easy," I said. I didn't move toward her. I just raised my hands slightly and stepped back, trying to make myself smaller, less of a threat. She stared at me, scanned the room, then looked down at herself. Her chest rose and fell faster now, a panicked flutter. "You're safe," I said, my voice as calm as I could make it. "You're not tied anymore. I found you yesterday. You were barely breathing." Her lips moved, trying to form sound. Nothing came. I reached for the cup and poured new water, then set it gently on the edge of the cot. She didn't reach for it. "You want it?" "It's there," I said, and backed away to the far corner of the room, giving her space to decide. She waited several minutes before slowly pulling herself up on one elbow. Her hand trembled as she took the cup. She drank slow. Every swallow seemed to her a testament to how long she'd been without. When she finished, she spoke. Just one word, her voice, a dry rasp. "Why?" I didn't answer right away. I didn't know how to. "Leaving you," I finally said. She watched me closely. Her brow was drawn, tight, eyes weary. I recognized that look. It was the look of a person who had seen the worst of the world. She didn't trust me. Maybe she never would. But she was alive. After a while, she asked again, her voice rasping, broken English this time. "Where?" "Canyon," I said. "My place. You're about 4 miles from where I found you." She glanced at the window, then back at me. "How long?" "Day and a half, maybe 2. Her jaw flexed like she was trying to remember something. Then her fingers clutched at the edge of the blanket. She winced, likely from the bruises under the surface. Her throat worked hard as she forced out a name. "Ayana." I looked at her and she looked back, her eyes meeting mine with a new intensity. "My name," she said again, a little stronger this time. "Ayana." I nodded once. "Eli." She repeated it softly. "Eli." And then silence again. The questions hovered between us. What had been done to her? What had she done, if anything? Why had she been tied like that, left to die? I didn't press. I didn't want to. I just wanted her to be safe. I got to my feet, stretched my sore legs, and walked toward the stove. "Rest," I said, not turning around. "I'll bring food when you're ready." As I ladled a bit of stew into a small bowl, I heard her shift under the blanket. I wasn't sure if she trusted me, but she hadn't asked me to send her away, and for now that was enough. Ayana didn't leave the cot that day. She barely moved. Her body remained wrapped in the blanket, one hand always gripping the edge of the fabric tight across her chest. She slept on and off in long, shallow cycles. Whenever she woke, her eyes would dart to the cabin door first, then to me, always watching, always measuring. I gave her distance. I didn't speak unless she did first, and she didn't speak much. I kept my movements slow, deliberate, like working near a spooked horse. Every noise, my boots on the floorboards, every shift of my coat echoed louder in that quiet space than it had any right to. She flinched more than once. When she slept, I sat outside on the stoop, cleaning the grit from my tools or mending an old leather strap on a saddlebag. The mule grazed lazily nearby, chewing down a dirt. The canyon was silent except for the breeze shifting through dried brush and the faint creak beyond the ridge. In the late afternoon, I stepped back inside and placed a tin bowl of cooked beans and cornbread on the table near the cot. Ayana was awake. She sat half upright, knees drawn up beneath the blanket. Her face was pale under the bronze skin, dry and still fever warmed. Her lips had stopped bleeding. The bruises down her arm had darkened to a deep purple. "I'm not sick," she said quietly, as if I might be thinking otherwise. Her voice was a little clearer now, still low and cracked. I turned from the table, resting one hand on the back of a chair. "Didn't say you were." She didn't move. I stepped away, back toward the stove. "Food's warm. Take your time." After a minute, she shifted, her bare feet hitting the floor. She winced as she stood. The dress hung awkwardly on her, still torn across the shoulder and chest, though she kept the blanket wrapped around herself tight. Her knees buckled slightly. She caught herself on the edge of the table. I stayed where I was, my muscles tense, ready to catch her if she fell, but I didn't move. Ayana picked up the spoon and ate, slow, eyes locked on the bowl. "Was it your tribe?" I asked, my voice quiet even. She paused, but didn't look at me. "Yes." She waited. "They said I brought sickness," she added a moment later. "Bad luck. Unclean." I said nothing. My throat was tight with a sudden boiling anger. I just watched her. She set the spoon down after 3 bites. "I don't believe you," I said. The words came out before I could stop them. "You don't know me," she replied, her voice filled with a defensive defiance. "I know what I saw," I countered, my eyes holding hers. She finally looked at me, her jaw clenched tight. I knew that look too. It was the look of a person who had fought their whole life and was ready for the next battle. I didn't press. Instead, I pulled out the second chair and sat down. You're safe here. Nobody comes this way. I was left to die, she said, almost like a challenge. You're not dead. We sat in silence. Fire crackled inside the stove. Outside, the sky dimmed, painting the canyon walls in streaks of orange and purple. Why do you live out here? She asked, a genuine curiosity in her voice. War ended, I replied. I don't want to go back east. Too many ghosts. She gave a small nod just once. Same. I leaned forward slightly. You got somewhere else to go? She didn't answer right away. Her eyes dropped back to the bowl. Number? I nodded. Then you stay as long as you want. No one will bother you. She looked at me again. No one knows I'm alive. Maybe that's good. Her breath came slower now. Her shoulders eased a fraction. I stood and took my coat from the wall peg. I'll sleep outside tonight. You take the bed. You already gave it. I'll stay near, I said. Not too close. Her fingers tightened on the blanket again, but she nodded. I stepped out into the dark. The old mule had already bedded down near the fence. I set down a folded wool blanket near the fire pit, laid my rifle beside me, and eased myself to the ground. I stared up at the canyon rim stars beginning to punch through the black. Inside, she was still scared. That much was obvious. Her trust was paper thin. She hadn't asked what I wanted from her, maybe because she assumed the answer. Most women in her place would have. But I hadn't come out here for her. I wasn't looking to save anyone. Still, the thought of her tied out there under the sun left for the buzzards. I couldn't get it out of my head. That wasn't something you forgot. I'd done what I could. Now she'd decide the rest. I rolled onto my side, eyes half closed, listening for the slightest movement inside the cabin. But she didn't come to the door. Didn't call for me. She just stayed. And for now, so did I. I rose before the sun, as I always did. I moved slow, careful not to let my joints crack too loud in the cold morning air. The fire I'd laid near the edge of the cabin wall had burned down to nothing but gray coals. I stretched out the stiffness in my back, rolled up the wool blanket, and slung it over my shoulder. Silas lifted his head but didn't bother to stand. A light wind rolled through the canyon, dry and sharp. I stepped quietly up to the cabin door, gave it a knock, then opened it without waiting. Inside, the cabin was still. The smell of wood smoke and old sweat hung faintly in the air. Ayanna was curled on the cot beneath the blanket, eyes open, watching me. I set down the blanket near the stove. Morning. She didn't answer. I filled the kettle and put it on the stove. Water's hot soon. I'll go check the traps. Won't be far. Ayanna sat up slowly, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Her voice came after a pause. You always sleep outside. I shook my head. Only when someone else needs the bed. Her gaze held on me, searching for an angle, a hidden meaning. You said ghosts. I didn't answer right away. I busied myself with the fire, feeding it a piece of dry cedar from the small stack near the stove. Flames caught and cracked. Wife and daughter, I said finally, died in the same week. Back in Illinois. Sickness. Fever. Ayanna blinked. Her arms tensed against her ribs. You leave after. Didn't have much reason to stay. That was the end of it. I didn't offer more. She didn't ask again. When the kettle whistled, I poured hot water into a tin mug with crushed leaves from the tin labeled mint. I set it beside her on the small table without comment. Then I strapped on my belt, grabbed the rifle, and stepped out. I didn't go far. Just beyond the cabin ridge were a line of iron traps waited near the creek. They were set mostly for rabbit and ground birds. Not much meat, but enough for two if stretched. One trap held a scrawny hare. I killed it quick and slung it on a wire hook from my belt. When I returned, Ayanna had dressed. She had tied the deerskin dress as best she could, one sleeve knotted at the shoulder to hold it up where it had torn. Her hair had been combed, with her fingers pulled into a single loose braid. The blanket now lay folded at the foot of the bed. She stood barefoot on the rough plank floor, watching the door like she expected someone else to come through it. I stepped inside and hung the rabbit near the stove. We'll boil it slow. Add beans later. Ayanna nodded once. Her eyes moved to the side table where my tools and spools of wire sat. What is your work? Telegraph lines, I said. Repair and keep them running. Government don't send men often, so they pay good for the few of us who will ride out this far. You fix wires. Every week, sometimes longer if a storm hits. She stepped closer to the table, her fingers tracing one of the metal spools. You go far. 50 miles sometimes. Always come back here. Ayanna looked up from the wire. Why here? I shrugged. Nobody else wanted it. I like quiet. Her expression softened a little at that. Later that morning, I skinned the rabbit while she swept the floor using the pine bough broom I'd made. The simple rhythm of chores gave the cabin life. No one spoke much, but the silence wasn't the same as the day before. It was softer now, a shared space. I boiled the meat in the cast iron pot, adding salt, pepper, and the last of the dried onion. Ayana sat at the table watching the steam rise. "You had family," she said, her voice cautious. I nodded. "Now you don't." "That's right." She was quiet a while. Then me too. I looked at her, not just at her face, but her posture. The way she sat stiffly even now, like she still expected pain from the next word or the next man. "You were cast out," I said, a statement, not a question. "They said I brought death," she answered, her voice trembling slightly with the memory. "Illness came. They blamed me. I wasn't sick, but people died. Old one's a child. You were alone after. They tied me at night," she continued, her words a hushed confession. "Took me in the morning to the rock fields. Left me there. I didn't speak. I stirred the pot, steam rising from the rabbit meat as it boiled slow. I didn't know what to say. The cruelty of it was a bitter taste in my mouth," she asked thin, softly, almost inaudibly. "Why did you cut me loose?" I glanced at her. "Didn't feel right to ride past. That's all." I nodded. "That's all." She studied me for a long moment. Then she stood and walked to the door. She didn't open it, just stood there, hand on the frame, staring out toward the sunlit band in the canyon where Silas still grazed. "If I go," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "I die. You don't have to go." She turned her head just enough to look back. "If I stay," my voice was even, "you do what you want. Stay as long as you want. Don't owe me anything." She stepped away from the door, crossed the room, sat down at the table again, and ate the stew without another word. By dusk, she had set the kettle herself and cleared the bowls without being asked. I watched her tie her hair again, slower this time with care. I stood to head back outside. She looked up and said, "You don't need to sleep on the ground." I met her eyes. "All right." So I laid a bedroll near the hearth across the room from the cot. I didn't face her when we laid down for the night, but I listened and heard her breathing slow, steady. She slept fully this time, and for the first time since she arrived, she didn't flinch in her sleep. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm. Not planned, not spoken aloud, just something that happened naturally. I would rise early, boil water, tend to Silas, check the wire line up the southern ridge. Ayana would rise after, slower, more careful with her steps, but steadier now. Each morning she swept the floor, folded the bedding, refilled the water pot. She didn't ask permission. She didn't wait to be told. On the 5th day, she took the broom from behind the door without a word and stepped outside. I watched from the corral as she began sweeping the stoop. Her braid fell forward over her shoulder beads, swaying gently as she worked. The deerskin dress still hung awkwardly on her body, torn at the neckline, patched now with a stitched scrap of an old undershirt I'd given her. The fit was uneven, but it covered her. I noticed, but I looked away. She didn't speak much that morning. I didn't either. Later, while she boiled rabbit bones for broth, I brought in the wire spool and began repairing a cracked relay box on the table. She sat across from me, watching my hands. "You use this for messages?" she asked, her voice soft with wonder. I nodded. "Used to be whole towns waited on one wire to know if war was coming or peace or rain." She ran her fingers lightly along the copper coil. "You believe in messages?" I paused, my work, looked up. "Not like that." She glanced down, her voice lowered. "I prayed someone would come." I watched her, my expression unreadable. "Someone did." She didn't smile, but she held my gaze a few seconds longer this time before looking away. In the afternoon, we walked together to the creek. I carried the pail. She carried the linen cloths to wash. The trail was narrow and shaded. She stepped lightly, her feet still raw from whatever road had led her to that stake in the desert. I noticed she walked with her head higher now, shoulders looser. When we reached the creek, she crouched at the edge and soaked the cloths. I knelt beside her and filled the pail. After a while, she asked, "Were you a soldier?" I didn't answer right away, just watched the way the water moved over stone. "Yeah," I said. "Union Army for years." "Did you fight?" "Some. Mostly scouted. Fixed lines then, too." She rinsed one of the cloths and wrung it out slowly. "You lose many." I didn't look at her. "Too many." The air sat heavy between us. The wind moved through the dry grass, but neither of us did. "I see death in your eyes," she said quietly. I nodded. "It never really goes." We stayed by the creek a while longer. When we returned to the cabin, she surprised me by saying, "I want to help, not just cook." "You are helping," I said. "I can do more." I thought a moment, then gestured toward the shed where my supplies were kept. "Wire spools are low. You help strip the old line. I'll teach you how to splice." She didn't smile, but she nodded. That afternoon we worked together for the first time. I showed her how to use the pliers to cut lengths of old wire, how to scrape the rust, how to coil and tie sections that could be reused. She picked it up fast enough that I had to slow myself down to match her pace. Her fingers were nimble, her movements careful, focused. When the sun dipped behind the canyon wall, I stepped back and watched her finish tying a bundle of wire. "You learned quick." She stood wiping her hands on her dress. I watched. I remember things. We walked back to the cabin side by side. No words, just shared ground under our boots. That night she didn't go to bed first. She sat by the stove long after the fire had dimmed, her knees tucked to her chest blanket around her shoulders. I sat across the room cleaning my rifle in slow motions, one piece at a time. Eventually she spoke again. "They said I brought death because a child got sick," she said, her voice low. "But the child played near the mines, drank from the wrong stream. Everyone knew it. They just needed someone to blame." I didn't interrupt. My mother stayed silent. My brother didn't come. They didn't even tie the ropes themselves. They made me walk. She took a breath. "They said if the desert didn't take me, I must be cursed." I set the rifle down on the table. "You're not cursed," I said the words, a hard, solid promise. She turned to me slowly. "How do you know?" "Because you're still here." She didn't say anything, but she didn't look away. Eventually she rose and crossed the room, walked right past me, then paused beside the bedroll near the hearth. "You sleep here again." "If that's what you want," I said. "I don't know what I want," she replied. I waited. She looked down at the folded blanket, then back at me. "I'm not afraid anymore." I gave the smallest nod. "Good." She stepped closer, just a foot. Her voice was barely audible. "Can I sit beside you?" I motioned to the chair across from mine. She sat, and we stayed that way into the quiet of the night. No more ghosts between us. Just the sound of firewood shifting in the stove and the soft presence of someone choosing to stay. That night, neither of us went to bed early. I sat by the stove, elbows on my knees, hands loosely clasped. My rifle lay disassembled on the table behind me, forgotten for now. Ayana remained in the second chair, blanket still draped around her shoulders, fingers fidgeting with the beaded edge of her torn dress. It wasn't warmth that kept us from sleep. It wasn't fear anymore either. It was something else. A quiet, charged attention neither of us could name, but both could feel. She looked at me not like before, not with caution or guarded suspicion, but with something searching, a look that stripped me bare. Her head tilted slightly. Her lips parted like she might speak, but then she didn't. I finally broke the silence. "You need rest." Her reply was soft. "I've rested too long." We sat still for another few minutes. Then she stood, moved to the bed, but instead of lying down, she turned to face me. "I don't want to sleep alone." I didn't move. I wasn't sure what she meant. Or rather, I did, but I didn't trust myself to assume. "You don't have to," I said, my voice even a fragile line of steel. She walked over to me slowly. Her bare feet barely made a sound on the floorboards. When she reached me, she let the blanket slip from her shoulders. It puddled at her feet, her dress torn as it was revealed more than it covered. Her cleavage was prominent where the stitch had given again, one strap tied loosely against her collarbone. Her body was curved and soft, skin bronze from sun and scarred in places that weren't visible until now, but she didn't look down. She looked at me, a direct, unwavering gaze that held no shame. My hands didn't move. My heart was pounding a wild drumbeat in my chest, but I held myself still. Ayana knelt beside me, resting her hand gently over mine. "You haven't touched me once," she said, a quiet observation. I nodded. "Not unless you ask me to." "I'm asking." I didn't speak. I stood slowly, took her hand. We crossed the cabin together, not hurried, not afraid. I didn't rush. I didn't pull. She led me to the cot and sat down first, pulling me with her. There was no urgency to it, no heat or hunger, just a quiet, profound need for human closeness. Our lips touched, soft, tentative. She rested her forehead to mine. Her breathing was calm. My hand brushed her hair aside, traced the curve of her jaw. She leaned into me. We laid down together. When I undid the tie of her dress, she helped me. When she touched the buttons of my shirt, I let her. We moved under the blanket in silence. Nothing forced, Nothing spoken. Her breath caught once a soft sob and my arms tightened gently around her. She pressed her mouth to my shoulder, trembling. It wasn't about passion. It was about being seen, being chosen, being allowed to stay. When it was over, we didn't roll apart. She rested her head against my chest. Her arm lay across my ribs. My hand moved slowly across her back in quiet, rhythmic passes. In the dark, her voice came low. "You don't want me to leave." "No," I said. "You still don't ask what I did." "I see who you are now," I replied. "That's enough." She let out a slow breath. "The kind people don't take until they finally feel safe." "I didn't think I'd ever feel clean again," she whispered. I kissed the top of her head. "You were never dirty." The room was still. The ghosts, the stake, the tribe, the war, the losses. They didn't vanish, but they got quieter. They laid together as the wind scraped softly across the canyon walls. Silas grunted once in his sleep, and the coals in the stove burned low. When morning came, neither of us stirred until the sun touched the windowsill. And when Ayanna finally rose, she was still naked beneath the blanket. She didn't hide. I sat up and watched her quietly as she dressed, as she tied the frayed strap over her shoulder with calm hands. She looked over her shoulder at me and said, "You're not alone anymore." I nodded. "Neither are you." We shared breakfast, simple rabbit stew. No words, just glances. And when I stepped outside to check the line, she followed, not out of fear, but because she wanted to walk beside me. The canyon had changed, not in appearance. It was still dry, still windswept, still framed by jagged stone, but something in its silence felt different now. It didn't feel like absence anymore. It felt like privacy, like protection. Ayanna walked beside me along the low ridge above the wire run. Her hair was tied back with a strip of leather I'd cut for her from one of my old gloves. It held the thick braid close to her neck, neat and tight. Her moccasins were mismatched, one old, one new, but she didn't stumble. Her feet had hardened. Her back was straighter. I carried the tool satchel and a fresh coil of wire. The wind tugged at the hem of my coat as I stepped around a broken post and knelt beside the base. Ayanna crouched beside me. She was learning to watch how I worked, not just with her eyes, but with quiet attention. She didn't interrupt, didn't rush, but asked only when a question was ready. "Why do these lines matter?" she asked, her voice low, sincere. I twisted a section of copper as I spoke. "They carry messages, words from one town to another. News orders, warnings." She nodded slowly. "Before the wires, writers, couriers. Took days. Now it takes seconds." "Right," I said. She watched as I stripped a damaged section, revealing the bright metal beneath. I handed her the pliers. She took them and held them properly, waiting for instruction. "Twist there just enough to bite." She did, careful and slow. It wasn't just about the wire. It was about the act of doing something together, of building, repairing, making use of time and hands and silence. After the repair, we walked the rest of the ridge in companionable quiet. When we reached the old well I'd covered months back, I took a long drink from my canteen and handed it to her. She drank, then wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. "Do you miss them?" she asked softly. I didn't need to ask who she meant. I nodded. "Every day." She looked down. "If I had a child," she hesitated. "I think I'd fight harder." "They loved her," I said. "They just didn't have anything left when the sickness came. No doctor, no medicine, just watching." Ayanna's fingers tightened around the strap of the canteen. "That's worse." I nodded. She stepped closer to me, rested a hand lightly on my chest. "Do you think it's possible starting again?" "With time," I said. She leaned into me briefly, then stepped back. We continued the walk. By mid-afternoon, we returned to the cabin. She took to the stew pot while I stacked chopped kindling along the inner wall. It was the first time she'd moved around the space like she owned a part of it. Not cautiously, not waiting for permission. That night after supper, we sat together on the porch. The stars were out. The canyon wind had eased. Ayanna leaned her head on my shoulder, her knees pulled up beneath her dress. I held her hand in mine. Our fingers didn't move, just rested together, warm and still. She spoke quietly, the words soft enough that they nearly got carried off by the night. I dreamed they came back. My people. They said I had to go. My jaw tightened slightly. "You're not going." I didn't say I would. I glanced at her. "Would you want to?" She hesitated. "I think part of me wants them to want me, but not enough to go back." "You belong where you're safe." "I belong where someone lets me be who I am." I nodded slowly. "That's here." She lifted her head, looked at me fully. "Then I stay." We didn't kiss. Not this time. Not every moment needed one. but the weight of that sentence lingered between us. More powerful than affection, more binding than promises. Later, I sat on the edge of the bed and pulled off my boots. She changed out of her dress behind me. I didn't turn, didn't watch. She pulled the blanket back and slid beneath it. I followed after. As we settled, her bare foot found mine beneath the covers. She didn't move it away. I let out a slow breath, one I didn't realize I'd been holding since the first day I'd seen her staked to the ground, half buried, almost gone. The ghosts were still there, both of ours, but for the first time they didn't feel so loud. And neither of us were alone anymore. The days moved faster now. Not because the weather changed. It was still dry, still cold in the mornings, but because the quiet between us had turned into routine, into rhythm, into something that felt like a life. I woke early as always, but now I'd wake with Ayana curled against me under the blanket, her leg looped over mine, her hair warm beneath my chin. Most mornings neither of us spoke right away. We didn't need to. I'd kiss her temple, she'd squeeze my hand. Then we'd rise together and the day would begin. By midweek, Ayana had taken on more of the cabin. She sorted the remaining dried food stores and wrapped the rabbit pelts tight in cloth for trade. She'd begun sweeping out the shed where the tools were kept, repairing a broken latch on the small cupboard. She asked for nothing, just did what needed doing. I let her. That morning I rode out to the northern bend alone to check a downline that had been humming strangely the night before. Ayana stayed behind, tending the stew and boiling more water to scrub the floorboards. It was the first time in days we'd been apart for more than an hour. She didn't say it out loud, but I knew it made her uneasy. She'd clung to me just a little tighter before I left. I didn't say much either, but I'd fix Silas's bell to the cabin door before I rode out, just so she'd hear it when I returned. I was gone until just before sunset. When I came back, the sky was red behind me and dust clung to my boots. Silas was tired. I dismounted, untied the saddlebag, and slung it over my shoulder. Ayana met me at the door. She didn't speak. She just opened it for me. And when I stepped inside, her arms went around my waist. I rested my chin on her head. All clear. No breaks. She didn't let go. Not yet. I dropped the bag and wrapped both arms around her. I kept thinking, she said softly. What if they came back while you were gone? They didn't. I know, she said. But still, I kissed her forehead. I won't leave long again. She nodded. That night after supper, I brought out the pouch I'd traded for in the town 3 days prior and placed it on the table between us. She looked at me curious. Go ahead, I said. She untied the string. Inside were sewing needles, colored thread, and a fresh piece of soft deer hide. Her fingers hovered over the items. You traded for this. I nodded. Figured you'd want to mend that dress proper. Maybe make something warmer. Her throat worked hard before she spoke. No one ever brought me anything like this before. You weren't mine to bring it to, I said. Now you are. She looked up at me, then eyes wide, unblinking. Then she stood, came around the table, and kissed me firm, slow, deeply. When we parted, she rested her forehead against mine. Say it again. You're mine, I whispered. That night, as we lay in bed, she reached for my hand and guided it gently down over her belly. I think, she said quietly, I might be carrying. The words came out fragile, like they could break if handled wrong. I didn't move at first. My hand remained still against her stomach. Then I swallowed once and looked at her. You sure? I've missed 2 moons and I feel different. I shifted to face her fully. One hand cupped her cheek. You scared? She nodded slightly. Not of the child. Just if it's true, I don't want to do it alone. You won't, I said, the promise, a solid thing between us. She closed her eyes. A tear slipped out and ran along her temple. I never thought I'd be a mother, she whispered. Not after what they said about me. What they called me. They were wrong. She opened her eyes. Do you want it? I want anything that comes with you, I said. Plain and certain. She exhaled softly, a tremor passing through her. Outside, the wind howled once through the canyon, but inside the cabin felt solid. Still. That night they didn't make love. They just lay close, holding each other. My hand rested gently over her belly, and Ayana, for the first time since she had arrived, slept without waking once. The frost came early that year. By late October, mornings were coated in thin silver sheets across the porch railing, and Silas's breath rose like smoke in the dim light before dawn. The creek slowed to a trickle, and the wind carried the bite of the mountains. But inside the cabin, things were different, warmer. Ayana stood barefoot near the stove, wrapped in a thicker dress she'd sewn herself from the deer hide I had traded for weeks earlier. It fit her better than anything she'd ever worn, hugging her hips, the neckline clean but still low enough to keep from feeling confined. Her belly had begun to swell, not much but enough that her hands now lingered there throughout the day, half conscious of the new life growing inside her. I watched her from the workbench, rubbing oil into the old Henry rifle. I didn't say much. I never did, but my eyes stayed on her longer now, less guarded, less afraid. I'd started sleeping through the night again. She turned toward me now, holding up the small moccasin she'd finished stitching. "Second one will take longer," she said, smiling faintly. "I keep redoing the heel," I chuckled. "They'll be walking crooked anyway. That's just babies." She smiled wider at that, then stepped toward me and placed the tiny shoe on the shelf above the stove next to the carved spoon I'd made from cottonwood. It looked like it belonged there. Everything did now. Later that morning, we loaded Silas and rode into the nearest settlement, Cold Brush Junction. It wasn't much, just a general store, a saloon, and a station where riders passed through once every 2 weeks, but it was the closest place with supplies, and we hadn't left the canyon in months. The moment we stepped off the trail and into town, eyes followed us. A white man and an Apache woman holding hands, riding side by side. No one said anything, not to our faces, but Ayanna saw the way some mouths tightened, the way shoulders shifted. She lowered her gaze, her fingers tightening in mine. I noticed. I stepped closer. "You're with me," I said low in her ear. "Let them look." We entered the general store together. The owner, a bearded man with a crooked leg, looked up from behind the counter and stiffened when he saw Ayanna. I set down the list. "We'll need flour, beans, dried fruit, soap, 2 pounds of salt, and a copper kettle if you've got it." The man didn't move. "She with you?" "She's my wife." The word landed like a dropped hammer in the quiet store. The man blinked, then nodded slowly and started packing the order. Ayanna looked at me, a question in her wide eyes. I hadn't asked her yet, not with words, but I'd said it now, plain and public. On the way out, she stopped me by the mule. "You said wife. You meant it." Her hand found mine. Her voice didn't shake. I took a breath, looked her dead in the eye. "You want to marry me, Ayanna?" "Yes," she said. "I already have." We didn't wait for a preacher. Back at the cabin, she took a strip of my coat lining and tied it around my wrist. I tied a beaded band from her old dress around hers. No one else was needed. That winter, we finished sealing the roof. I built a second cot from pine boards, then laughed and tore it down when Ayanna said the baby wouldn't need a separate bed for a long time. We started planting early in the thaw, turnips, carrots, and beans. She laid out a circle of stones near the front door where herbs could grow in spring. Silas got fat, and the cabin, once half forgotten in a canyon no one used, began to feel like a home that had been waiting for us all along. One evening, months later, Ayanna sat on the porch wrapped in a wool blanket, her belly full and round. Her feet rested in my lap while I whittled a toy from a cedar branch. "You never told me her name," she said. I looked up. "Your daughter, the one you lost." My hand slowed on the knife. "Emma," I said. "Emma Wade." She nodded, eyes on the horizon. "Then this one will carry her name too." I said nothing for a long time. Then I reached over, took her hand, and kissed the inside of her wrist. We stayed there till the stars came out and the cold settled in around us like an old familiar coat. The ghosts hadn't left, but they didn't rule the house anymore. And in the canyon where silence once meant sorrow, it now meant peace. We had survived. We had stayed, and we had built something that could not be taken away. The story of Eli and Ayanna carries a profound message about forgiveness, patience, and the ability to change in the face of hardship. Through their journey, we learn that life doesn't always unfold as we expect, but it is through genuine care and patience that significant transformations can take place. Eli, despite carrying deep scars from his past, finds the capacity to love and open his heart when he chooses not to abandon Ayanna, who is also facing her own pain and rejection. The story reminds us that even though life may be full of challenges, if we do not give up hope and trust in the possibility of positive change, we can still build a home and find peace within ourselves. Patience, selflessness, and compassion are timeless values that help us navigate the difficulties of life, enabling us to overcome obstacles and heal our wounds. Enjoying these epic Wild West stories? Hit subscribe for more gripping tales of bravery, conflict, and unexpected heroes. Now tap the video on screen to experience a story with a twist you'll never forget.